So it just happens to, so you're being shown to the public.
All right, and we should be getting connected to Facebook Live right now. Well, it is 7:02 and it looks like we are connected to Facebook. And so it seems like it is time to get started. People are logging on. First, I want to start by saying hello and welcome to our first virtual speaker event of the fall. My name is Rebecca and I'm the Education Director here at Wenatchee River Institute. Before we turn it over to Daniel Matthews, I want to do a couple of other introductions. To start, I'd like to introduce Carolyn Griffin-Boogert, the Executive Director of Wenatchee River Institute.
And welcome. We're so glad you're joining us this evening. This, as Rebecca said, is our first fall Red Barn event. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Wenatchee River Institute, we are an environmental learning center located in Leavenworth, Washington. And our mission is to connect people, communities, and the natural world. And at the Wenatchee River Institute, we really believe that people's physical health, mental health, and spiritual health can be healed and nurtured by connecting with nature. And particularly during these times when we are so isolated in our homes and doing everything over the internet, nature is even more important to us. So while normally we would be bringing this event to you live on our 9-acre campus, and you'd be sitting in our Red Barn, a sustainable building, and looking at the beautiful views out the window and hearing the Wenatchee River babbling in the background. We're all in our homes, but we still believe that environmental education is the key to kind of keeping our planet safe and keeping us all healthy. So thank you for joining us, and I'll turn it back to you, Rebecca.
Thank you, Carolyn. We are also really excited to be partnering with Leavenworth's A Book for All Seasons for this event, and I'm so glad Teresa is able to join us tonight. I wanted to give you a chance as well, Teresa, to introduce A Book for All Seasons.
Hi, thank you, Rebecca. And I'm just thrilled to have Daniel here and to be doing this event. This is an important book, and we sell it here at A Book for All Seasons. It's in our nature section and also in our science section because there's a lot of science in it. We are open 10 to 7 every day, 7 days a week. You can order online. You can come in. You can have us deliver to you curbside, or we can ship to you. So please keep us in mind when you want to order this book. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. We are, of course, also thrilled to have Daniel Matthews here to present this evening. With this presentation format, we will have time for questions at the end of the program, and questions can be asked as comments on Facebook, and then we will pass those on. Daniel Matthews is the author of Natural History of the Pacific Northwest Mountains, Rocky Mountain Natural History, Cascade Olympic Natural History, and the book he's presenting on tonight, Trees in Trouble. During a career of writing about the natural history of Western North America, he has backpacked far and wide, watched for fires from Desolation Peak Lookout, witnessed a 40-foot fir crash into his family's house in a storm, and lived for years in a forest cabin without electricity, heating with firewood and riding by kerosene lamp. Daniel, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Rebecca and Carolyn and Teresa. And hello, everyone. I'm gonna get small here. A small part of your screen is my understanding. I'm going to show you a bunch of slides and talk about my book, and I'll also talk some about recent events that aren't covered in my book. Sorry, technical glitches here. Fires, of course, are the recent events I'm talking about. Forgive the delay. So there's the book. And I'm going to start, the way I start the book is describing the park-like stands of Ponderosa Pine, or dominated by Ponderosa Pine, that were characteristic of much of eastern Washington and Oregon and much of the rest of the West at the time when the settlers arrived. It got that way thanks to frequent fires, some of them set by indigenous people, many of them also set by lightning, but that fire regime of the frequent low severity fires is what they're adapted for and what made the forests look like this. And it's what we would like to get back to. So there's a picture, an actual photograph from around 1900 of one of these stands. And here's a recent photograph of a stand which is brought back to similar condition, though without so much grass. This one has a little bit more brush. I'm going to read you a description of one of the settlers of this kind of forest, just because I love this description so much. These settlers were on the Oregon Trail. Our drive of the forenoon of September 8th, 1853 was still among the pine openings. The atmosphere was loaded with balm. Balm meaning fragrance coming out of the tree bark. I can almost say I never saw anything more beautiful. The forest so different from anything I've seen before. The country all through is burnt over. So often there is not the least underbrush, but the grass grows thick and beautiful. It is now ripe and yellow, and in the spaces between the groves, which are large and many, it looks like fields of grain ripened, ready for the harvest. So even this Oregon Trail pioneer, seeing it for the first time, saw the evidence of fire and saw the connection to the fire having burnt through, being why the forests were the way they were. On the right there, sitting down, is Jerry Franklin with his dog. Name of the dog is slipping my mind. Something like Springer, but no. Anyway, his sidekick, Norm Johnson, is standing up there. I began my researches for this book by going along on Jerry's annual field trip for a specially select group of graduate students at University of Washington. They look at forests, including some of these East Side Ponderosa pine forests. They learn how to plan prescribed fires and sometimes thinning to go before the prescribed fires. This is controversial in some circles, but Jerry's a firm believer that a lot of these forests have already reached a point of excessive density and ladder fuels, where if you lit a prescribed fire, the big old trees would be in danger of burning, the way they never were as long as the frequent fires came through at low severity and kept the brush out of the way and held back. Only small numbers of the big old trees would burn in that situation, but now they're at risk, and the big old trees is what Jerry wants to save. The Forest Service put on a little demo of several different thinning and burning prescriptions here in Camp Sherman, Oregon, and they let people compare them side by side and comment on them. Some of them favor Western Larch, which is a fabulous tree. You have quite a bit of it around the Wenatchee area. And it's maybe even more fire resistant or fire tolerant than Ponderosa Pine. Here we move down to a stand by Lake Tahoe at Emerald Point. That's Hugh Safford on the right, the scientist I visited in that area, and he showed me this grove where Ponderosa pine mixes with Jeffrey pine, which is very, very similar and maybe even more fragrant. If you read the book, you'll hear a lot about my love for the fragrance of Ponderosa pine country. In California, they get this strange notion that Ponderosa pines can be distinguished from Jeffrey pines by not smelling like vanilla, but they're crazy. It's not true. But I do confess that Jeffrey pines may be even more richly fragrant. And perhaps some of the Ponderosa pines in that area maybe aren't so fragrant, but up here they are. This represents the start of chapter 2 on fires. This is an actual fire tornado, which the Weather Bureau was able to forecast this year near the California-Nevada border. And sure enough, it happened. It's kind of an alarming phenomenon. We're not sure how long real fire tornadoes have been around. Fire whirls, which are a small version of them, have certainly been around for a long time, but in 2018, when there was a terrible fire tornado in Redding, California, part of the Carr fire, it was only the second definite occurrence of a fire tornado in the record. The first one having been in Australia a couple of years earlier. This picture represents the aftermath of a really severe fire. The kind that consumes almost everything. This is the Las Conchas fire in New Mexico. I went down there to see Las Conchas. It was how many years? 7 years after the fire. And that was the second. There were repeated fires on this site, and that's part of why the fire was able to consume so much of the wood. Here's a broader view of the same landscape, showing the vastness of this high severity patch. Even there, though, you see there's one stand of surviving Ponderosa pines over there on the left-hand edge. Still, it won't be enough. They aren't enough of a seed source to reseed this area. And also the soil is badly damaged, and it's not likely that this site, which was a beautiful Ponderosa pine forest before the first fire, the dome fire, hit it. And it's not likely that it will be one again in our lifetimes, and maybe not for thousands of years to come, because of climate change and together with the lack of seed sources when the high severity fire patches are so enormous. Here's another terrible, enormous high severity fire, the Hanceville in central British Columbia. In the book, I wrote that it was half again as big as the one immediately to the north the same summer, and both of them were bigger than any megafire yet seen in the United States, in the lower 48 states. But that's already untrue. This summer, what's it called? The August complex fire in California is much bigger than this Huntsville complex fire, though still not quite as big as the British Columbia fire just to the north of here. This was really interesting, the way the lodgepole pines were bent over in the heat of the fire. I think it was a kind of steam bending where the heat of the fire front reached them and softened them, while the wind blowing out from the front of the fire bent them over, and then the fire came and scorched them and removed all the topsoil, incinerated it, sent it into the sky. But we don't have to go to other states and provinces to see this kind of high severity moonscape that follows on a pair of fires. This is right near Wenatchee. What's it called? Just west of the Columbia River in the Entiat drainage. This fire burned in 2014 and followed one in 1994 on the same site, and therefore was able to consume most of the wood. And it's also questionable whether this site can return to forest. This picture was taken from a small plane by John Marshall of the Wenatchee area. Thank you, John. This is a map showing how extensive recent fires have been in the Okanagan-Wenatchee National Forest. These fires all came between 1994 and 2018, and they really covered a lot of the area. And if you counted back to include 30 years before that, even more of the area would have been scorched. Some of these were almost entirely high severity fires and still look pretty drab on Google Maps, even 20 years, 15 to 20 years after the fire. Here's the smoke in 2017, which wasn't even one of the really bad fire years in in that area. The worst years were 2014 and 2015. But in 2017, you did have the Diamond Creek fire up near the Canadian border, which is the patch of smoke you see up there in top center of the image. And here's this month, the fires of California and Oregon on Labor Day night, which blew up when powerful east winds blew across the Cascade and Sierra crests and just blew like blowing on a campfire with a bellows. They just turned small fires into enormous fires that made enormous gains of 100,000 acres overnight and produced incredible amounts of smoke, as you see here. Ooh. Excuse me, I'm pushing the wrong tiny button. And here's the smoke after it blew out to sea. A really vast plume of small particulates. Now, these fires in Western Oregon, in the moist forests west of the Cascade Crest, are kind of a new thing. And there's been a lot of misinformation online about this. There's been a lot of debate over whether it's climate change or bad forest management that's causing the terrible fires of 2020. And the truth is, it's both of them. And in different proportions. In California, Scott Stevens just said in an interview a couple of days ago that he thinks it was at least 50% bad forest management and less than 50% climate change. But here in Western Oregon, it's a completely different story. And the misinformation has started with conflating the two. When we say that bad forest management is causing worse fires, more severe fires, and perhaps bigger fires in the in the forests that were adapted to low severity frequent low severity fire like Ponderosa pine forests. That's talking about California and the Rocky Mountain area and east of the Cascades in Washington and Oregon, where Ponderosa pine grows. It's not talking about these forests west of the Cascades, which are dominated by Douglas fir with some hemlock and big leaf maple, etc., but mostly Douglas fir. These forests were thought to have had a long-term fire regime consisting of big, severe, infrequent fires that would occur during strong east wind events, which is exactly what we had on Labor Day night and the next day that blew the fires up in this area. And here, some people have wanted to latch onto this bad forest management theme mistakenly. Some of them just out of confusion because of hearing these smart scientists talking about that factor in California and Eastern Washington, Eastern Oregon, and the Rockies in the Ponderosa pine forests where it's true. They just latched onto that and want to generalize and don't understand that it's a different story here. Other people are latching onto it because they want to say that the reason we're having these terrible fires here is that wicked environmentalists didn't allow the loggers to keep logging. Well, this white outline is the outline of the Beachy Creek fire, one of the worst and biggest in Western Oregon last week. And as you can see, it's riddled with recent clear cuts. This fire did not spread because anyone was preventing logging from happening. The extent of industrial logging in this landscape is even a little bit more than it seems in this photo, because in some of the areas that are national forests, like most of this heavy logging is in privately held industrial land. But even in the parts that look darker green, if you were able to zoom in on Google Maps and look at them, you would see they're also riddled with fire with forest roads and older clear cuts. So this is almost entirely an industrial forest landscape. And that did nothing to slow this fire down. It's exactly what this fire liked. And there have been just a few studies that have looked scientifically at whether industrial forestscapes in Western Oregon and Western Washington are more or less fire prone than natural old growth forests. And the indication is that the plantations are more fire prone. Susan Pritchard of the Matau Valley is one of the scientists who has contributed to this science. Even down in California, where I said lack of management was a big part of the problem, it's not necessarily a lack of logging. In the lower right-hand part of this North Complex fire, which was also an incredibly large and fast blow up on the night of September 9th and the day of the 10th. I guess I mean September 8th and 9th. Forgive me if I got that wrong. But when the winds were blowing, they were doing the same thing down in California, and they caused this enormous blow up of more than 100,000 acres overnight in the North Complex fire. And a substantial part of that was in heavily clear-cut forest as well, as you can see with the speckles down in the lower part of this fire. But even in California, where scientists are saying that forest management is a big part of the problem, they're not talking about a lack of clear cutting. They're talking about a lack of fire, a lack of the normal low severity fire regime, which was ended with fire suppression. And before that, with the removal of indigenous people from the land and the introduction of large numbers of sheep, depending on where exactly you're talking about. Sheep were a big part in some areas because they got rid of the grass, which used to be able to carry fire, carry really cool, low severity fires from one side of the Ponderosa pine forest to another. That stopped happening between these several reasons. And finally, Smokey Bear got efficient about it too. So there's been maybe 100 years in most of the West of a lack of low severity fire on the landscape. Shockingly enough, it's hard to figure out exactly how much fire there was in California in the olden days, but the best estimate is that California used to have 4 or 5 100,000 acres of fire a year, which is just the number that this year's fires are beginning to approach at 3.6 hundred-thousand acres. But there's a huge difference now that this is mostly high severity fire, whereas in the olden days, it was mostly low severity fire. Chapter 3 is about insect infestations. And this is a picture from probably 2015 in California of a badly hit pine beetle infestation, which was killing most of the sugar pine and ponderosa pine trees that were mixed in this mixed conifer forest. There were also another species of pine beetle killing some of the fir trees, and pine beetles were even involved in killing some of the incense cedars, though relatively speaking, they were one of the best surviving trees at this time. The infestation exploded because of the worst 4-year period of drought within the human recorded time period. And so it was indirectly an effect of climate change that was also contributed by the great density of the forests, which resulted from fire suppression. Then the next question is, first a picture of pine beetles closer up. This is blue stain in a Ponderosa pine tree, which is caused by a fungus which the pine beetle carries with it, which attacks the tree and provides food for the larvae of the pine beetle. In the lower part, I have a peeled large piece of bark there, which shows the kind of spaghetti-like curlicue pattern of this kind of pine beetle, the western pine beetle, which mostly attacks Ponderosa pine. And there's a close-up of a mountain pine beetle. They're only about the size of a grain of rice. There's the entomologist Diana Six using an increment borer to take a core from a tree to measure its growth rings. Thought I'd throw in a few pictures of the scientists I talk about in the book. Maybe some of you may have already read it, and so this will help you visualize these people I talk about. This is Emily Heyerdahl, where she's just sawn the other kind of tree ring sample called a cookie. She's able to cut just the fire-scarred part of an old stump, but she could do this also with a live tree by taking less than 25% of the perimeter of the tree where the living growth rings are. The tree can survive, and she's gone back and tested some of her old sites to confirm that that very few of the trees that were sampled are dying from that. So I was trying to say there's controversy over whether pine beetle infestations are likely to lead to worse fires. And it's still kind of an open question, but one group of California scientists predicted that that the really heavy mortality that I showed you a few pictures back with the lake in California, that the death of so many really large trees, such a high percentage of them in those forests, was going to lead to mass fire effects. And we're still waiting to know for sure, but the fire that came close to that lake I showed the picture of, which is called the, so many fires, so many names. That other fire in California last week. that blew up one of the others, and it spawned a few fire tornadoes, which are mass fire effects. And so this may be coming true from those pine beetle infestations and the sheer mass of fuel that they're leaving behind. Okay, this is Tom Swetnam, the tree ring god at his homestead in the Jemez Mountains of New Mexico. The rock rubble behind him in the picture there is the remains of a Jemez indigenous people field house, a summer dwelling that he has. He has several of these little ruins on his little plot of land. They seem to like being up in the hills for the cooler weather, for growing their squash and corn and beans. And this is a really interesting artifact they left behind in bedrock, these little cupules a few inches across and several inches deep. And the archaeologists haven't even figured out what they were for, but it was probably ceremonial. This is Andrew Ellicott Douglas, the founder of tree ring science, and a sequoia stump that he was sawing away at with a saw which looks too small for that stump. But he got some good wood cookies out and started getting an idea. He was the first to start to get an idea of how old sequoias were. But he didn't really know at first how to recognize old trees. And he didn't know that close to his home, there were actually much smaller trees that were just as old, or at least a better record of hundreds and hundreds of years of growth. Because really old trees aren't always really big. Here's the lab of Andrew Merschel in Corvallis, Oregon, showing the modern methods of tree ring science, where he has a computer-linked microscope looking at the tree rings and actually doing the measuring and counting of rings and instantly recognizing sequences of wider and narrower rings, which used to take a lot of work for Tom Swetnam and Andrew Ellicott Douglas and other tree ring scientists of old. Now it can be done much faster, recognizing the patterns like Morse code that tell you how old a section in a tree is. Here he's marked one of his cookies, his fire scar samples, with the years of those several fires, 1751, 1779, and so on. Chapter 5 is about the Pinyon Pine forests and how they are the forests most on the edge and most likely to become deforested because they are getting just too hot and dry to support forest growth in a lot of cases. Though that's also true of plenty of Ponderosa pine forests, it's maybe not true of as high a proportion of them. This, of course, is at Mesa Verde. Mesa Verde, the national park, was covered with Pinyon Pine woodland until 1990 or so. And since then, it's been hit by a whole sequence of fires that covered most of the national park, as you see in this map of the series of fires. The pink outline is the outline of the national park. Pinyon pines there are several species of them, and they have their own several kinds of pine bark beetles. This area has not burnt. It was largely killed by pine beetles at Walker Pass near the southern end of the Sierra Nevada. Chapter 6, Thin and burn is about prescribed burning, which we need so much more of, and in combination in some locations with some thinning. This shows a helicopter, if you can see it right at the middle of the picture, and below it is a kind of giant, it's called a helitorch, a drip torch suspended by a helicopter for lighting prescribed fires. Sometimes you just want to burn a bigger area than will be efficient for fire crews with drip torches. And this is one of the ways of doing it, and ping pong balls is another. You can read about it that in the book. This is a prescribed fire, sort of an experimental one that was studied by 4 crews of scientists, and it was down in south central Oregon. This crew from the Desert Research Institute in Nevada was using this drone to go up and capture air directly above the fire to measure its chemistry. They're finding that the chemistry in prescribed fires tends to be much less toxic than over wildfires, partly because the wildfires can be much more severe, partly because they are more likely to include buildings, which have much more toxic smoke than natural forests do. Another set of scientists using drones was doing imagery of the prescribed fires, and this is an example of the imagery they got. It captures infrared radiation as well as the visible spectrum. So you can see there the trees and also the plume of heat rising in a plume from the fire. This is a pretty cool image, I think. I kind of wanted it for the cover of the book. Back to John Marshall's imagery here. He did some repeat photography where he was able to find old photographs showing how much less dense forest used to be on the east side of the Cascades. This one's at Mission Ridge. And the upper picture was taken in the 1930s. As you can see, there's a lot more space between the trees than there was in the 1990s when he took the second picture. Sorry, the date's actually showing there, but it's hidden by Teresa D. Litzenberger. This is an example of the benefits of prescribed fire and thinning. To the right of the road, this forest was thinned. To the left, thinned and burned with prescribed fire. To the left, it was not, and it was much more dense. As you can see, when this very small wildfire came along and killed all of those trees. But firefighters, I think the fire did cross the road to some extent and scorch the bottoms, the bases of those pines. But it remained a low severity fire there because the forest had been thinned and burned. We still don't do anywhere near enough prescribed fire in the West, but they have carried on a tradition of it continuously since indigenous people days in the Southeast, or at least since the early 1900s. This is an example of a longleaf pine savanna, which has been burned every few years in North Carolina. Then there's a chapter called North and Up, about how forests will move north with climate change. Species will move north, genetic strains will move north. They will naturally invade farther north of where they are now, and strains will die out to some extent at the southern edges of their range. This is a picture of a redwood planted 40 some years ago on San Juan Island in Washington, hundreds and hundreds of miles north of Coast Redwood's natural range. And the trees that were planted on on San Juan Island by this individual are all doing just great. They're not reproducing because it probably requires a low severity fire to get redwoods and sequoias to reproduce naturally. Then I have a series of 3 chapters specifically on the issues of white bark pine and other white pines. Not only are they attacked by pine beetles of all kinds, but they're attacked by an invasive fungus called white pine blister rust. So in most of the range of white bark pine, most of the mature trees have been killed over the last 40 years. And you see these ghost forests that have turned white. The trees actually keep standing for a long time. They're really tough and hard wood, and they're still standing. They may be several decades old. And you see this sad sight over much of the Northern Rockies and Cascades. This one is in the Central Oregon Cascades, showing Mount Washington, Three Finger Jack, and Mount Jefferson from North Sister. Here's the research site of Diana Tomback just outside Yellowstone National Park. And here's a close-up of the fruiting bodies of white pine blister rust. In the summer, it comes out with these cankers, which you can recognize it by. Before that, you can just kind of tell because the upper part of the tree, the foliage is all turning red and dying. This is one of the several research nurseries where they are planting possibly resistant strains of white pines of several species and deliberately infecting them with white pine blister rust to see which strains actually show some genetic resistance. From that, they'll be able to collect seeds eventually and reseed the natural habitat of white pines with these resistant strains. So there's still some hope for these species, and as well as some natural resistance turning up and allowing some of them to persevere in the wild. Though unfortunately, the ones that are resistant to white pine blister rust are not resistant to bark beetles, so they're still kind of at risk. This is kind of funny to me, seeing how when they let these boxes of pines keep growing, you get these ridiculously large trees growing crowded in tiny boxes. I bring the book near to its close with a chapter on Bristlecone Pines, which in some ways I think are the most gorgeous forests I've ever walked in. They're the oldest tree species on Earth. Some individuals are more than 5,000 years old. So if they can't persevere into whatever climate change throws at them, then what can? I think that some of them will probably be able to persevere for a long time. Trees that look mostly dead are actually still alive, and that's their strategy. That's their successful longevity strategy working. They have a live strip of bark on one side of the tree while the other sides of the tree have died. They can get really twisty up there in the wind. And the dead bark is as hard as rock. I can't scratch it with a fingernail, and it comes in all these amazing colors. Partially with the help of rotting fungi, but because the wood is so incredibly dense and dry, fungi are not able to make much inroads into it at all, and rot is not much of a factor in killing these trees once they reach maturity. It's a close-up of some of the patterns you see in the park. This is a view of a white bark pine stand. It's one of the very few healthy white bark stands I've seen. It's near Tioga Pass in Yosemite National Park. White pine blister rust has so far not been able to reach that far south in the Sierras in any great numbers. So that's why you find healthy stands down there, entire healthy stands. But there's, it has reached that far south a little bit lower in elevation where it isn't as cold. It has attacked the other species of white pines. So we're not real optimistic that it's not going to be able to reach this stand 2 eventually, especially with climate change warming things up. I end the book with an afterword where I went back and visited some of my sites a little bit later and some sites which had had some of the most notorious fires. This is the site of the Carr Fire tornado in the outskirts of Redding, California. And this is Paradise, California, where the Camp Fire destroyed almost the entire town. And here's the paradox of Paradise, California. A lot of the trees in the town are still green. Some of them, this is a coast redwood, which must have been planted there because it's also outside of the range of coast redwoods. It was planted there and it was completely defoliated in the fire. And 11 months later, it's already covered with green shoots because redwoods are so good at resprouting after a fire. So I'm relatively not worried about redwoods. And even the ones that were hit by a fire in Santa Cruz County this summer, most of them seem to be surviving, and even a lot which may look defoliated now will still resprout. But it is an amazing thing in Paradise that there's still, as you see, a lot of the canopy trees are still alive and green. Once the fire hit Paradise, it was really the houses that carried the fire, not the trees. And it shows what can be accomplished through hardening houses and entire neighborhoods of houses to fire. If it's done well enough, I think that is the solution to the increased fire risk to small communities throughout the West. And I think that concludes my talk. So I'll open things up to questions.
That sounds great. There are questions coming in from Facebook. Folks have lots of questions for you. Starting with, what causes a fire tornado?
Oh, that is so difficult. And the scientists who study it are not entirely in agreement. But it's actually very common for there to be some vorticity when in fires. It's caused just by wind shear, which is like two different wind directions meeting. And funny thing is, it's usually clockwise. And some people have hit on that as because tornadoes are normally clockwise, but some of the fire tornadoes are actually counterclockwise. I could refer you to some really technical papers trying to explain fire tornadoes, but it's kind of over my head. But apparently, one thing that can happen is one of these small vortices. They're called fire whirls when they're just of a modest size. The reason we call just a few of them fire tornadoes is that they meet the standards for a tornado, which is winds above, I'm not sure, 100 miles an hour or somewhere up there. The one in Redding, California was around 135 miles per hour, which makes it a class 3 tornado. But class 1 tornadoes are not quite that intense. It's thought by some of the scientists that if you have a fire whirl, one of these small twisters, you can, if they suddenly hit a lot of much more intense fuel, it can make them stretch upward and become more powerful. And that might have happened in Redding from the fire hitting a bunch of houses all at once. Interestingly enough, some of the fire scientists can show you one of these fire whirls in the lab, and I got to look at one and take pictures of it in Missoula. It's pretty cool. Next question.
Next question. I think it has 2 parts, so I'll just ask you both together. Can humans make up for the lack of seed sources in places of intense fires? And would it be helpful for humans to spread seeds of plants that would help balance nitrogen in the dead soil?
Yes and yes. As for seeding and planting seedlings within high severity areas where there's no seed source, absolutely, I support that. It needs more money. We need to fund a lot more of it. I personally believe that it's a good opportunity to plant northward, perhaps of strains, more southerly strains within the same species, perhaps in some cases even of other species, to assist plants in doing what they're going to have to do anyway with climate change. Unfortunately, in some of the places, some of the studies of failure to reestablish a forest after a high severity fire, there have been seedlings planted, and those have failed along with natural reseeding. So it's not always going to work. It's clear that in some of the hotter, drier locations, it may not work until you happen to plant at the right time relative to several years in a row of wetter than normal, wetter than average conditions. And the bar for that keeps rising with climate change. More heat makes it drier because it evaporates the water faster. So there are going to be some of the areas which used to be forest that are just not going to be able to be forest again because of climate change. Let's see, the second question was about planting in particular.
Seeds that would help balance the nitrogen in that burned soil.
Sure. Yeah, I think that can be a good idea sometimes. And especially in these fires west of the Cascades, there's not much we can do. Like trying to have a less dense forest isn't really going to help prevent future fires or to even slow down their spread, because with so much rain, the forests just get dense really quickly anyway, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. The only thing I see that's a little bit less flammable is the deciduous vegetation, the alders and big leaf maples. And Jerry Franklin has long advocated to allow more of this early seral vegetation as opposed to just conifers, which is what the timber industry always wants to plant. So if you encouraged alder and big leaf maple in some of these sites and within the terrible fires, and especially if they were strategically placed as fire suppressing belts, this might do at least a little bit to slow down future fires. Big leaf maple does not fix nitrogen, but red alder does. So that's the one that would deal with that. East of the Cascades, there are a number of nitrogen fixing plants, and one of them, which tends to come back really strongly after fires, is snowbrush, Ceanothus velutinus. And I haven't heard of anyone wanting to actually plant it because it shows up anyway, and they used to try to kill it all the time, but Jerry Franklin told me they don't really need to kill it because it kind of helps with the nitrogen fixation, and It's also that conifers are showing they can come up through it if you give them time. So it's not such a terrible competition after all, as the foresters used to think it was. Bitter brush is also nitrogen fixing and would be a good thing to have as an understory with your Ponderosa pine. And it's also one of the very best plants for browse for deer and elk. So it's a good thing to encourage. Next question.
Thank you. The next question is, could you speak more on the invasive grasses at Mesa Verde, which you wrote about in the book?
Yeah, I promised in the book that the biological answer to cheatgrass would be coming soon. And I haven't checked this month, but as far as I know, it still hasn't. It keeps getting slowed down and it's still imminent. But even when it comes, it's not going to solve the problem except in a few high value areas where you really want to do this, because it's just going to be too much trouble and too expensive to do over the vast areas of the West that have cheatgrass. So there isn't really a good solution about that except trying to prevent, I don't know, I don't know, maybe reseeding native grasses after fires that can compete with cheatgrass.
Thank you.
I don't have a ton to offer on that one.
The next question that I have for you is, what characteristics do larks have that make them more fire resistant than ponderosas?
Well, they're deciduous. They drop their needles in the winter. And so that means that if a larch is defoliated in a fire, it doesn't suffer as much as an evergreen tree because it was planning to replace all its needles next year anyway. So that's one theory. Then, of course, they always talk about thick bark, and both larch and Ponderosa pine, especially at maturity, have relatively thick bark, so that helps. So that's the best guess as to why it might be even more fire resistant, but it's not, it's not a definite explanation. It's just they observe that it seems to be really fire resilient.
Sorry about that. The next question I have for you is, what is adaptive management?
Adaptive management.
Yeah.
Let's see. I don't think that's a phrase I use, and I'm not sure exactly. Maybe the questioner could tell me more about what they're talking about. But I mean, it sounds like a good, enlightened approach to management in general. I'm sure I've heard that phrase used quite a few times. I just haven't really looked up what all it means, but it would be a management that looks at I would think it would usually want to look for more heterogeneity and diversity in the landscape and more resilience to future fires and future insect infestations, especially through heterogeneity.
Thank you. And there's a small delay between you and I right now on Facebook. So if someone hears that and has more information for that question, I will pass on the addition to the question. Oh. The question is coming in, I believe. Well, I'm waiting on that. You had mentioned that there on the west slopes of the Cascades in Oregon, there is a long-term fire regime of big fires that are like moved by that eastern wind. And I was wondering if you could speak about that a little bit more.
Yeah, it's a little bit hard to tell because the trees we have west of the Cascades don't tend to retain fire scars the way Ponderosa pine does. So it's hard to cut a wood cookie and see all the fire scars and know exactly when each and every fire that scarred this tree came along, which is what they can do with Ponderosa pine. But by mapping cohorts of the ages and matching up ages, if you see a cohort where a lot of the trees in an area seem to have grown, to have initiated at almost exactly the same year, then it's likely that that was soon after a fire. So they have put together fire history maps, and the best guesses is that there is this history of fairly large, fairly severe fires, quite possibly just as large as the fires we had this summer and this fall. But there's still some debate, because sometimes people have gone back to the same areas, and by looking even more closely, they've found more diversity in the ages of the fires than they saw the first time. So it's unclear that these were huge fires that killed almost all the trees in a large area, or whether they just killed a lot of trees and still left a fair number of survivors. And maybe there was another fire that got some more of the trees 50 years later. But so then that's the question: is there anything even wrong? If you take this really long view of fires, is there anything really out of line about the fires that happened this month in Oregon? And it's a little bit hard to say, but they're certainly bad in terms of the damage they did to what's left of old growth forest, and bad in terms of the houses that were burned down, some people killed, a lot of resources lost. So we don't like them. And we hope that we aren't going to see fires like that coming along many times more within the next 50 years. And the fear is that certainly climate change is having some effect. It did make everything a little bit drier and hotter than it would otherwise have been. And that likely made the fires a little bit more intense than they would otherwise have been. And it could, going forward, make this kind of fire a little bit more frequent than it would have been historically. Click that sound again, please.
Thank you, thank you. What happened to the 5,000-year-old stump the guy saw down in your book?
What happened to the 5,000-year-old stumps?
Yes, you talked about it in your book, that someone cut down a 5,000-year-old stump.
Oh, right. Yeah. Really sad story, but actually that one was a little less than 5,000 years old. At the time, it was the oldest, but fortunately since then, it's turned out that they found some older ones, and probably there are any number of still older ones, but we don't want to go and core every single bitter pine in the White Mountains in California. But the one that was cut down, a scientist wanted to study some of the really big old pines, bristlecones, and he was doing this in eastern Nevada, and he saw this one and thought it would be a good candidate, and he applied to the Forest Service for permission, and they did cut it down for him, and it turned out to be, at that time, almost 5,000 years old, and the oldest known tree at that time. That guy, I think he got a lot of flack for that, needless to say. I think he sort of gave up that career and pursued a different career, and eventually passed away. I think he passed away before learning that there was an older tree. Next question.
Let's see. I am waiting to see if we have other questions coming in. Well, I'm waiting to see if anyone else on the Facebook world has questions for us. One of the things I was thinking about is you definitely talked about how humans can play a role, and some people have already asked a few questions about that, but I was wondering, like, what do you think we can do as people? Like, what's the takeaway for us in the big picture?
Well, the medium big picture is to advocate for more of that prescribed fire, managed wildfire, and some thinning that the dry forests east of the Cascades need. The bigger picture is to completely change the world's energy economy so that we aren't emitting greenhouse gases anymore, and to bring that change about as rapidly as possible, because there's just so much that's going to go wrong with the world from climate change. Forest health is just a small part of it, and forest fire, but not that it's small, but it's relatively small. And we really need to elect elected politicians who will do that.
Thank you. And I think we've got one final question that has come in for you, and then I think it's time to get wrapped up. And this last question, what is your favorite Cascades mammal and why?
I suppose marmots are up there, and martins, because I've seen martins a couple of times, and they're really cool, but I haven't seen them very much. Marmots I can almost count on seeing, and they're really cute, and they're kind of interesting in that they manage to eat enough in 5 months to last through the other 7 months of the year. It's incredible. They have to double their weight, and I like the sounds they make, the whistles, and charismatic fauna. They're cute. Wolverines are really cool. I love writing about them, but I haven't seen one.
There's just so many to choose from.
Yep.
Wonderful. Well, Daniel, thank you so much for being here this evening. Clearly, some of the people watching have already read your book. I have it on my list to read and to purchase. And Teresa, if you're there, if you want to remind us how we can buy Daniel's book, at least in Leavenworth.
Yes, so A Book for All Seasons is on Front Street, 707 Highway 2, but actually on Front Street. And we're open 10 to 7. You can order online, and you can come in person. If you order from us over the phone or online, we can deliver to you curbside, or we can ship to you. So, yep, it's in our nature section or in our science section. Easy to find. Thank you.
One more thing I could add. Am I still audible?
You are.
Okay. On Twitter, I'm Dan Matthews, PNW, not Daniel, but Dan, DANMATHEWS, Pacific Northwest, PNW. And if you want to contact me there and ask me a question, I can post answers. I can post links to some of the scientific papers, for example, if you want to read more in that vein. So I'd love to hear from you again, everyone. Thank you for listening. And thank you for hosting me.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for adapting to the virtual environment. I'm glad that we didn't have to reschedule again, but that we could instead transition to being virtual to get to hear about your wonderful book. Wenatchee River Institute has other events coming up. This is our first virtual fall community event, but there will be more. I think starting next week, there is a tracking class online, and there will be more speaker events coming. So check our Wenatchee River Institute website. If you are interested in hearing more about these, you can also get signed up for our newsletter, and you'll get alerts about those. Those are some of the things happening in the community education world. In the youth education world, we are doing really small day camps here on site in Leavenworth in the afternoons. Right now, we're working with kindergarten through 5th grade, and camps are open for registration, happening a couple afternoons a week. And then we're also putting together lessons for teachers to support their teaching of next generation science standards, because they are all out. Well, our local teachers are all also working in that virtual environment. So we want to support them with some science education and bring some of our hands-on science education programs into that virtual environment. So if you're interested in hearing more about Wenatchee River Institute, you can get signed up for our newsletter to hear what's going on. And I think that brings us to the end of the evening. Thank you again, Daniel, and thank you so much, Teresa. It has been a really fun and educational evening.
My pleasure.
Thank you.